It is January 17th, 1920. In a few hours, the United States of America will become the world's first major nation to ban alcohol entirely. No wine, no beer, no whiskey, not a single drop legally. The government was convinced it had solved one of society's greatest evils. What it had actually done was create one of the most spectacular failures in American history. Welcome to Prohibition, the era that gave birth to organized crime, turned ordinary citizens into criminals, made gangsters into celebrities, and taught America a lesson it would never forget. To understand Prohibition, we must go back, not to 1920, but to the 1800s. America has always had a complicated relationship with alcohol. By the mid-1800s, the average American adult was drinking nearly 3 times more alcohol per year than today. Saloons were everywhere, and for many families, especially working-class women, the saloon was the enemy. It was where husbands drank away their wages, where violence was born, where families were destroyed. A grassroots movement began forming. Women's groups, religious organizations, and social reformers united under one simple demand: ban alcohol. They called themselves the temperance movement. After decades of activism, the temperance movement achieved the impossible. On January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. This single paragraph outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors anywhere in the United States. It was the first and only time in American history that a constitutional amendment took away a freedom rather than granting one. The Volstead Act, passed months later, gave teeth to the law. It defined intoxicating liquor as anything containing more than 0.5% alcohol. America went dry at midnight on January 17, 1920. And almost immediately, things started to go wrong.
Within hours of Prohibition taking effect, the black market for alcohol exploded. Bootleggers, people who illegally produced and sold liquor, became the new entrepreneurs of America. Some used existing distilleries, operating in secret. Others built hidden stills in basements, barns, and forests. The term bootlegger itself comes from the old frontier practice of hiding a flask in the leg of a boot. In the first year alone, federal agents seized over 7,000 illegal stills. But for every one they found, a dozen more appeared. The money was simply too good. A barrel of beer that cost a few dollars to brew could sell for hundreds on the black market. Prohibition had accidentally created the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. If you wanted a drink in Prohibition-era America, you went to a speakeasy. These were secret bars hidden behind unmarked doors, behind laundromats, in church basements, inside private clubs. The name speakeasy reportedly comes from the instruction to speak easy, quietly, when ordering, so as not to attract attention. At their peak, New York City alone had an estimated 30,000 speakeasies, more than twice the number of legal bars that existed before Prohibition. Many speakeasies were elegant, sophisticated establishments serving the finest bootleg liquor alongside jazz music and dancing. The culture they created, Jazz Age, the Charleston, the Flapper, became the defining aesthetic of the 1920s. Ironically, Prohibition may have made drinking more fashionable than ever.
Prohibition didn't just create bootleggers, it created empires. Criminal organizations, which had previously focused on petty crime and prostitution, suddenly had access to billions of dollars in alcohol revenue. They used this money to build hierarchies, bribe politicians, corrupt police departments, and arm private armies. The 5 Points Gang in New York, the Purple Gang in Detroit, the Chicago outfit. These were no longer street gangs. They were corporations that murdered their competition.
The violence between rival gangs for control of bootlegging territory would leave hundreds of bodies across American cities throughout the 1920s. And presiding over all of it, like dark royalty, was a young man from Brooklyn who had just moved to Chicago. His name was Alphonse Capone.
Alphonse Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919, 1 year before Prohibition began. He was 20 years old, a street tough from Brooklyn with a violent reputation and a razor-sharp business mind. By 1925, he was running the city. Capone's operation, at its peak, grossed an estimated $60 million per year, roughly $1 billion in today's money, from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. He employed over 1,000 people. He had the mayor, the police chief, and dozens of judges on his payroll. The press loved him. Chicagoans were fascinated by him. Capone understood public relations instinctively. He opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression. He gave money to charities. He called himself a businessman. In many ways, he was the first celebrity criminal in American history. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. In a North Side Chicago garage, 7 members of the Bugs Moran gang, Capone's main rivals, were lined up against a wall and executed with machine guns by men dressed as police officers. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre shocked the nation. It was the single most dramatic act of gang violence in American history, and it finally turned public opinion against gangsters. President Herbert Hoover personally ordered the federal government to bring down Capone. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, began building a case. Capone had survived countless rival assassination attempts, police raids, and congressional investigations. But in the end, the government didn't get him for murder. They got him for something far more mundane: tax evasion. In 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. The trial lasted just over a week. The evidence was overwhelming. Capone's own financial records showed millions in income he had never reported. On October 17, 1931, he was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and fines totaling nearly $100,000. He served time in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and later Alcatraz, the new maximum security island prison in San Francisco Bay. By the time he was released in 1939, Capone had advanced stage neurosyphilis, a disease that had been destroying his mind for years. He retired to his mansion in Florida and died there in 1947, aged 48, a broken man. The King of Chicago was gone. Capone was just one man. The corruption Prohibition unleashed ran through every layer of American society. By the mid-1920s, it was estimated that over half of all police officers in major American cities were on the payroll of bootleggers. In Chicago, the entire city government was essentially rented by the outfit. In New York, Tammany Hall politicians openly attended gangster parties. Even Prohibition enforcement agents, the very people charged with stopping the flow of illegal alcohol, were notorious for accepting bribes. The Bureau of Prohibition, formed in 1920, dismissed or convicted over 1,700 agents for corruption in its first decade. Prohibition had not made America virtuous. It had made America corrupt.
Prohibition changed American society in ways its architects never intended. Women, who had been largely excluded from saloon culture, flocked to speakeasies. For the first time, men and women drank side by side in social spaces. This mixing of the sexes was seen as scandalous by older Americans and thrilling by the young. The flapper emerged, a new kind of American woman who cut her hair, shortened her skirts, smoked cigarettes, drove cars, and drank cocktails. She was the living rebuke to everything Prohibition stood for. At the same time, Prohibition had complicated racial dimensions. Jazz music, created by Black American musicians, was the soundtrack of the speakeasy era. But the same white Americans who danced to jazz in speakeasies often supported the very segregation laws that oppressed the musicians playing it. Not all bootlegging happened in city warehouses.
In the hills and hollows of Appalachia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, a tradition of home distilling stretching back generations simply refused to die. These were the moonshiners, farmers and mountain men who had been making whiskey in secret for centuries. Prohibition actually expanded this culture dramatically. Demand from cities was insatiable. Bootleggers in Chicago and New York sent trucks into the mountains to buy moonshine by the barrel. The drivers who hauled illegal liquor and learned to evade police on mountain roads at terrifying speeds would eventually, decades later, create a racing culture. That culture became NASCAR. Some historians argue that the modern American love of motorsport was born directly from the chase between moonshiners and revenue agents on mountain backroads.
The economic consequences of Prohibition were catastrophic for legitimate businesses and surprisingly beneficial for criminals. Before 1920, the alcohol industry was one of the largest in America. Breweries, distilleries, saloons, and related businesses employed hundreds of thousands of people and generated enormous tax revenue for federal and state governments. When Prohibition hit, all of that tax revenue vanished overnight. The federal government lost an estimated $500 million in annual tax revenue, billions in today's money. Meanwhile, the cost of enforcing Prohibition was staggering, and all of it, every dollar, went to fund a law that wasn't working. Economists who later studied the period concluded that Prohibition was one of the single greatest economic policy failures in American history. One of the great ironies of Prohibition is that it was largely driven to passage by women, and it was largely driven to repeal by women too. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, founded in 1929, became one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the country. Its founder, Pauline Sabin, was a Republican socialite who had originally supported Prohibition, but she had watched it turn her country into a nation of criminals and hypocrites, and she turned against it with a fury. The WAND NPR grew to over 1.5 million members, larger than the Women's Christian Temperance Union that had pushed Prohibition through in the first place. These women argued that Prohibition was destroying families, funding organized crime, and teaching children that the law was something to be laughed at. They were right. By 1929, public opinion on Prohibition was souring. Then the stock market crashed. The Great Depression changed everything. With millions of Americans unemployed and starving, the argument for legalizing and taxing alcohol became undeniable. Economists estimated that legal alcohol could generate hundreds of millions in tax revenue and create hundreds of thousands of jobs immediately. Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president in 1932 with repeal of Prohibition as a central campaign promise. He won in a landslide. On March 22, 1933, just weeks after taking office, Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act, legalizing beer and wine with low alcohol content. He reportedly said as he signed the bill, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." Americans agreed. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, becoming the only constitutional amendment in American history to repeal another. Prohibition was over. It had lasted 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. That night, bars across America opened their doors legally for the first time in over a decade. The celebrations were extraordinary. In New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, people danced in the streets. Distilleries that had been sitting idle reopened within days. The federal government, desperate for revenue during the Depression, immediately began collecting alcohol taxes, taxes that are still collected today. Prohibition was dead, but its legacy would endure for generations.
Prohibition ended. Organized crime did not. The gangs, hierarchies, and networks built on bootlegging profits simply adapted. They moved into gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, and legitimate businesses infiltrated with criminal money. The Italian-American Mafia, which had been a minor presence in America before Prohibition, emerged from the era as a dominant national force. The Five Families of New York, the Chicago Outfit, the Detroit Partnership, all of them had been built and consolidated during Prohibition. The structures they created in the 1920s would operate virtually unchanged for the next 50 years. The FBI wouldn't begin to seriously dismantle them until the 1980s with the RICO statutes. Prohibition had accidentally created the most sophisticated criminal network in American history and then left it in place. For all its failures, Prohibition gave birth to an extraordinary cultural moment. The speakeasy era produced the cocktail culture that still defines American bar life today. Before Prohibition, Americans largely drank straight spirits or beer. The harsh, unrefined taste of bootleg liquor drove bartenders to mix it with juices, syrups, and bitters to make it palatable. The result was the cocktail as we know it, the sidecar, the bee's knees, the South Side. Prohibition also exported jazz to the world. As New Orleans and Chicago musicians followed the alcohol money to New York and then to Europe, to Paris and London, jazz became the first truly American art form to conquer the globe. The culture of the speakeasy, romanticized and mythologized in films and literature, became one of the most enduring aesthetic periods in American cultural history.
Historians, economists, and policymakers have spent nearly a century studying what went wrong with Prohibition. The lessons are stark. First, you cannot legislate morality. When a law is so widely violated that it loses moral authority, when ordinary law-abiding citizens become criminals in the eyes of the state, the law itself is undermined. Second, prohibition of a vice rarely eliminates it. It simply transfers the profits from legitimate businesses to criminal ones. Third, unintended consequences can dwarf intended ones. Prohibition was designed to reduce crime, poverty, and family breakdown. It increased all three dramatically. The Cato Institute, the Brookings Institution, and virtually every serious policy research organization that has studied Prohibition has reached the same conclusion. It was a well-intentioned catastrophe. The shadow of Prohibition falls long across American history. Every debate about drug policy, vice laws, and government regulation of personal behavior takes place in its shadow. When America began the war on drugs in the 1970s, critics immediately drew the parallel. Weren't we making the same mistake? Creating black markets, funding criminal organizations, imprisoning ordinary citizens for personal choices while doing little to reduce actual consumption? The ongoing wave of marijuana legalization across American states, more than half have now legalized it in some form, is in many ways a direct echo of the repeal movement of the early 1930s. The same arguments, the same economic logic, the same recognition that criminalization was creating more problems than it was solving. Prohibition's ghost walks the halls of American policy to this day. On January 17, 1920, America went dry. And in going dry, it learned something profound and permanent about itself. That freedom, once taken, demands a black market. That vice, forbidden, becomes seductive. That criminals given a monopoly on pleasure become kings. Prohibition is the story of how a nation of reformers, intending only good, unleashed consequences they could never have imagined. It is the story of Al Capone and jazz music, of flappers and federal agents, of corruption and courage, of a constitutional amendment passed in idealism and repealed in pragmatism. It is, perhaps, the most American story ever told. Grand ambition, spectacular failure, and the stubborn insistence, eventually, on learning from our mistakes. The bars are open. They never really closed.